Have you ever noticed your dog scooting their butt across the floor? Maybe your cat's been losing weight, having diarrhea, or your veterinarian mentioned something about finding a parasite on a fecal test. Maybe you adopted a puppy or kitten from a shelter, your dog goes to daycare or dog parks, or spends a lot of time outdoors, and now you're wondering, could my pet have worms? Many pet owners assume that parasites are only a problem for neglected animals or pets that live outside. But the truth is, intestinal parasites are extremely common in dogs and cats, even in pets that are well cared for, loved, and living in clean homes. And yes, sometimes those parasites can affect people too. Now, you might be wondering, what could a veterinarian possibly teach me about parasites while being on a Caribbean island? Well, interestingly enough, when I was in vet school, I had several classmates who were infected with worms when they were in schools here in the Caribbean. We'll talk more about this later because parasites can affect people too. Parasites are not just something that we manage in our pets. They're something we need to understand as part of keeping our entire family healthy. I'm Dr. Matt Clark with Class and View Veterinary Clinic, and I'm here to help. This is Beyond the Vet Visit. Before we get started, I want to remind you that this video is intended for educational purposes only. Every pet is different, and the information discussed here should not be considered a diagnosis or substitute for professional veterinary care. If your pet is experiencing severe diarrhea, vomiting, weakness, weight loss, dehydration, bloody stool, or any other concerning symptoms, please contact your veterinarian for advice specific to your pet. The goal of this channel is to help you better understand veterinary medicine so you can have informed conversations with your veterinarian and feel more confident caring for your pet. So, does my pet have worms? That's a question I hear from pet owners all the time. The truth is that intestinal parasites are much more common than many pet owners realize. And one of the most important things to understand is that parasites do not only affect pets that are neglected, unhealthy, or live outdoors. A loved family dog that goes on walks every day can get a parasite. An indoor cat can also get parasites. A puppy or kitten from a responsible breeder can come with parasites already. These organisms are simply part of our environment that the pets live in. Now, when most people hear the word parasite, they usually picture a worm. And while worms are certainly the most common intestinal parasites we see, they're not the only ones. Dogs and cats can be affected by several different intestinal parasites, including roundworms, hookworms, whipworms, tapeworms, coccidia, and giardia. Some of these parasites are large enough that you might actually see evidence of them. Others are microscopic and can only be identified through testing. Some cause obvious signs like diarrhea, weight loss, or vomiting. Others may cause little to no symptoms at all. That is what makes parasites so interesting and sometimes frustrating. A pet can look completely healthy and still have an intestinal parasite. And because some of these parasites can occasionally affect people, understanding them is important, not only for your pet's health, but also for your family's health. Today, we're going to break down the most common intestinal parasites we see in dogs and cats, how they're diagnosed, what signs they can cause, how they're treated, and what you can do to protect your pets and yourself. So, let's start by answering one of the biggest questions. How do veterinarians actually know if a pet has a parasite? So, how do veterinarians know if a dog or cat has an intestinal parasite? This is a great question because many owners assume that if they don't see a worm, their pet doesn't have them. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Many intestinal parasites are too small to see with the naked eye. In fact, some of the most common parasites that we diagnose in dogs and cats are identified by looking for microscopic evidence rather than actually seeing the parasite itself. The most common way veterinarians screen for intestinal parasites is through a test called a fecal examination. A fecal test involves looking at a small sample of your pet's stool to search for evidence of the parasites. Most commonly, we're looking for things like parasite eggs, also called ova, or other microscopic stages of the parasite. Think of it like looking for clues at a crime scene. You may not actually find the criminal, but what you find might give you evidence that they were there. In the same way, veterinarians often don't need to see the adult parasite itself. Finding eggs or other microscopic evidence can tell us what parasite is affecting your pet. One of the most common tests performed is what's called a fecal flotation. During this test, the stool sample is mixed with a special solution that allows the parasite eggs to separate and float to the surface where they can be examined under a microscope. Veterinarians may also use additional tests depending on what parasite they're concerned about. For example, Giardia is a microscopic parasite that may require a different type of test because it doesn't always show up reliably on a routine fecal examination. This is one reason why your veterinarian may recommend additional testing if your pet has ongoing diarrhea or symptoms that don't match the initial results. Now, an important question many owners ask is, if my pet's fecal test is negative, does that mean they definitely don't have parasites? And the answer is not always. A negative test is helpful information, but no test is perfect. Parasites don't always shed eggs or organisms every day. So, depending on the timing of the sample, the pet could potentially have a parasite that's not being detected in that particular stool sample. This is why veterinarians sometimes recommend repeat testing, especially in young puppies and kittens, pets with ongoing GI signs, or animals with a higher risk of exposure. The quality of the sample also matters. The fresher the stool sample, the better. If you're bringing in a sample to your veterinarian, it's best to collect a small amount and store it according to your veterinarian's instructions. You don't need to bring an entire bag of stool. Just a small representation is usually enough. So, before we start talking about specific parasites, remember this. Just because you don't see a worm doesn't mean a parasite isn't there. And just because a pet looks healthy doesn't always mean they're parasite free. That's why routine veterinary care and appropriate testing are such important parts of keeping your pet healthy. Now, let's talk about one of the most common intestinal parasites that we see in dogs and cats, roundworms. When many pet owners picture a worm infection, roundworms are usually what they imagine. Roundworms are large intestinal parasites that live inside the digestive tract. They're often described as spaghetti-like worms because of their long, round appearance. The most common roundworms we worry about in dogs and cats is a species called Toxicera, although other roundworms can occur as well. These parasites are especially important because they're extremely common, particularly in puppies and in kittens. One of the reasons roundworms are so common is because they have several different ways of spreading. In puppies and kittens, one of the most important ways roundworms spread is from the mother before birth and through the milk after birth. They can also become infected through nursing and exposure to contaminated environments. Adult dogs and cats can also become infected by swallowing microscopic roundworm eggs in the environment. These eggs can be found in the soil, contaminated areas, or places where infected animals have defecated, and they can stay there for months or even up to years without dying off. A dog sniffing around the yard, a cat exploring outside, or a pet licking contaminated material off their paws can potentially expose themselves to infection. Pets can also become infected by eating infected prey animals, which is one reason outdoor cats that hunt may have additional exposure risks. The signs of roundworms can vary quite a bit. Some pets may have no obvious symptoms at all. This surprises many owners. The reality is that many intestinal parasites can be present before a pet starts showing noticeable problems. When signs do occur, they might include a pot-bellied appearance, especially in puppies or kittens, poor growth or difficulty gaining weight, vomiting, diarrhea, decreased energy, coughing, trouble breathing. In some cases, owners may actually see the roundworms in their pet's stool or maybe in their vomit. And while that can be alarming, it also provides valuable information for your veterinarian because it might help identify what parasite is involved. Roundworms matter for a few different reasons. First, they can affect your pet's health. Heavy infections, especially in young puppies and kittens, can cause significant illness. Young animals have smaller bodies and fewer reserves, so a parasite burden that might be tolerated by an adult pet can be much more serious for a puppy or kitten. Second, roundworms are one of the intestinal parasites that can potentially affect people. This is called a zoonotic disease, which simply means a disease that can pass between animals and humans. People can become infected by accidentally swallowing microscopic roundworm eggs from the contaminated soil or the environment. Roundworm eggs can survive in the environment for long periods of time, which is why simple habits like washing hands, picking up pet waste, and routine veterinary care are so important. The good news is that roundworms are one of the parasites veterinarians are very familiar with managing. Through appropriate testing, deworming when needed, and prevention strategies, we can greatly reduce the risk and help keep our pets healthy. Now that we've discussed roundworms, let's move on to another important intestinal parasite, hookworms. If roundworms are the parasite many owners recognize because of their appearance, hookworms are one of the parasites veterinarians take very seriously because of the way they affect animals and potentially impact people. Hookworms are small intestinal parasites that attach themselves to the lining of the intestinal tract and feed on blood. Unlike roundworms, which are usually large enough to be seen, hookworms are smaller and are typically diagnosed through microscopic testing rather than seeing the worm itself. The most common hookworms we worry about in dogs and cats include species such as Ancylostoma. These parasites are especially important in puppies and kittens because heavy infections can lead to significant blood loss and illness. Hookworms have several ways they can infect dogs and cats. The most common route is through the environment. Hookworm eggs are passed in the stool of infected animals. Under the right conditions, these eggs develop into larvae that live in contaminated soil and other environments. And even worse than roundworms, hookworms can live in the environment for a few years or even longer. A pet can become infected when those larvae penetrate the skin or when the pet swallows them while grooming or exploring. This is one of the reasons that pets spend time outdoors digging in soil or have exposure to contaminated environments might have an increased risk. Puppies and kittens can also become infected from their environment at young ages. Unlike roundworms, transmission from mother to puppies before birth is not considered a primary route of infection for hookworms. The signs of hookworms can vary depending on the number of parasites present and the age and health of the pet. Some pets may show very few signs. Others can become quite sick. Because hookworms feed on blood, heavy infections can lead to anemia, which means there's not enough healthy red blood cells circulating throughout the body. Signs might include pale gums, weakness, low energy, weight loss, poor growth in puppies and kittens, diarrhea, or dark and bloody stool. In young puppies, especially, hookworms can become a serious problem because they have smaller blood supplies and fewer reserves. This is one reason that routine parasite prevention and screening is so important in young animals. Hookworms matter because they can cause significant disease in pets, especially young animals. But they're also important because they are one of the intestinal parasites that can affect people. This is where I want to share that story that I mentioned earlier. When I was in veterinary school at Oklahoma State, I had several classmates who had started their veterinary education at schools in the Caribbean before transferring. And one story almost every one of them had was about learning firsthand that hookworms are not just problems for dogs and cats. They learned very quickly that spending time barefoot in areas that are contaminated with hookworm larvae could potentially allow those larvae to penetrate human skin. In people, this can cause a condition called cutaneous larva migrans, where the larvae move within the skin and cause itchy, irritated, and sometimes winding skin lesions. Now, this doesn't mean that every beach yard and outdoor area is dangerous. It means that parasites exist in the environment, and simple precautions like wearing shoes in areas where animals might defecate, picking up pet waste, and maintaining good hygiene can help reduce risk. The good news is that hookworms are a parasite veterinarians understand very well. With appropriate testing, treatment, and prevention strategies, we can successfully manage infections and help protect both pets and people. Now, let's move on to another common intestinal parasite, whipworms. Whipworms are small intestinal parasites that live in the large intestine, also called the colon. They get their name because of their unique shape. The front part of the parasite is thin and thread-like, while the back portion is thicker, giving it a shape that resembles a whip. Unlike roundworms and hookworms, whipworms are much more common in dogs than in cats. They're especially important because they can cause ongoing intestinal problems and can sometimes be really challenging to eliminate from the environment. Whipworms spread through the environment like the other worms do. Adult whipworms living in the intestines can produce eggs that are passed in the stool of infected dogs. Those eggs can develop in the environment and then remain there for long periods of time. A dog becomes infected by swallowing these microscopic eggs, often while sniffing, licking, or eating something that might be contaminated. This can happen in places where many dogs spend time, such as yards, parks, kennels, or other areas where infected dogs have been present. One of the challenges with whipworms is that the eggs are extremely hardy. They can survive in the environment for 5 or 7, maybe even more years under the right conditions. This means that even after an infected dog is treated, the environment may continue to be a source of exposure for years. The signs of whipworms can vary. Some dogs, again, may have no obvious symptoms, especially with mild infections. However, When whipworms cause disease, they commonly affect the GI tract, showing signs like chronic diarrhea, straining to defecate, mucus or blood in the stool, weight loss, or maybe decreased energy. In more severe infections, whipworms can cause significant inflammation in the colon and may lead to more serious illness. This is one reason veterinarians pay attention to persistent diarrhea, especially when other common causes have been ruled out. Whipworms are important because they can be frustrating to diagnose and frustrating to manage. Unlike some parasites where owners might actually see the worms, whipworm infections are usually identified through fecal testing. However, whipworm eggs are not shed very consistently and not always shed every day. This means a single negative fecal test doesn't always rule out an infection, especially if a dog has a symptom or history that might make whipworms a concern. Another challenge is the environment. Because whipworm eggs can survive for long periods of time, dogs can potentially become reinfected even after successful treatment if they continue to be exposed to those areas. This is one reason veterinarians recommend ongoing parasite prevention that includes protection against whipworms for dogs that might be at risk. One common misconception with whipworms is that if my dog was treated for them, they can't get them again. Unfortunately, like we talked about, that's not true. Treatment can eliminate the parasites that are currently living in your dog's intestinal tract, but it doesn't remove the eggs that are already in the environment. The good news is that the whipworms are a parasite that we're very familiar with managing. Again, with the right treatment, prevention strategy, and we can reduce the risk of infections, and we can also help keep your pet healthy. Now, let's move on to another parasite that many owners recognize because it's usually the one they see at home: tapeworms. If there's one parasite that tends to get the biggest reaction from owners, it's probably the tapeworm. Many people picture a long worm living inside their pet, and while that's technically true, there's a lot more to understand about how tapeworms work. Tapeworms are a flat, segmented intestinal parasite that attach themselves to the lining of the digestive tract. The most common tapeworm that we see in dogs and cats is called Diploidium caninum. Unlike roundworms and hookworms, tapeworms usually don't cause significant illness in otherwise healthy pets. However, they are still important because they're common, and they can be alarming for owners to discover. And they usually point to other problems that need to be addressed. The most common way that dogs and cats become infected with tapeworms is by swallowing an infected flea. This is an important connection because we talked about fleas in a previous episode. A flea can become infected with tapeworm larvae. When a dog or cat then grooms themselves, they might accidentally swallow that flea. Once the flea is digested, the tapeworm can continue its life cycle inside your pet's intestines. This is why flea control is such an important part of preventing certain tapeworm infections. It's not enough to simply treat the tapeworms. If a pet continues to be exposed to fleas, the infection will come right back. Dogs and cats can also become infected with other types of tapeworms by eating infected prey animals such as rodents and rabbits. This is one reason that outdoor cats and pets that hunt might have additional exposure risks. Many pets with tapeworms show very few signs. In fact, some owners only discover a tapeworm infection because they notice something unusual around their pet's rear or maybe in their bedding. One of the most common things owners notice is a small white segment that looks kind of like a grain of rice. These segments are pieces of the tapeworm that break off and leave the body through the stool. When they're fresh, they might even move around, which can be a little surprising or concerning for owners. Other possible signs might be scooting, licking around the rear end, mild digestive upset, occasionally decreased appetite, or maybe weight loss. However, I do want to point out something important. Scooting doesn't always mean that your pet has tapeworms. Scooting can also be caused by things like anal gland issues, allergies, skin irritation, or other issues. If your pet's scooting frequently, your veterinarian can help you determine the underlying cause, even if it's not tapeworms. Tapeworms are important because they're common and because they tell us something about other parasite risk. For example, if we find a tapeworm infection caused by Diploidium, we also want to think about fleas. The tapeworm itself may be easy to treat, but if fleas aren't controlled, reinfection is very possible. This is why parasite management is often about looking at the entire picture rather than just treating the parasite we see. Veterinarians also care about tapeworms because some types of tapeworms can also affect people, although the common flea-associated tapeworm is not typically considered a major concern for owners. Good hygiene, flea control, and preventing pets from hunting or eating unknown animals can help reduce the risk. The good news is that tapeworms are usually very manageable when properly identified and treated. By combining appropriate treatment and flea prevention and good parasite control habits, we can greatly reduce the chance of repeat infections. We have covered 4 of the intestinal parasites that veterinarians commonly see in dogs and cats: roundworms, hookworms, whipworms, and tapeworms. And while these parasites are different, there is one thing that they all have in common. They are much easier to manage when we understand how they spread, how they're diagnosed, and how they can be prevented. But there are 2 other intestinal parasites that are a little bit different. Unlike worms, they're microscopic, and they're responsible for many of the questions and confusions I hear from pet owners. In part 2, we're going to talk about coccidia and giardia, what those positive test results mean, whether parasites can affect your family, and the most important thing that you can do to protect your pets. I'm Dr. Matt Clark. Thank you for joining me for Beyond the Vet Visit. I'll see you next time, and go Pokes.